Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to this special edition of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Skrovan. In this series, Ralph and constitutional scholar Bruce Fein will lay out articles in the impeachment of President Donald J. Trump. As regular listeners know, Bruce Fein is no radical lefty. He is a Republican who has worked in the Reagan administration, as well as for conservative think tanks like the Heritage Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute. Mr. Fein has a lot of experience with impeachment. As a young lawyer, he served in the Justice Department during the impeachment of Richard Nixon. He also worked with Republican floor manager Bob Barr, not Bill Barr, Bob Barr, different guy. He worked with Congressman Bob Barr from Georgia to draft the articles of impeachment of Bill Clinton. Bruce is a real stickler for the Constitution and has written extensively about that founding document and how we as a country have strayed from many of its core articles, and in doing so have created what the framers most feared, an imperial presidency, an executive branch with king-like powers. So this series of podcasts is an effort to take you beyond the politics of the moment, as perilous as these times are, and offer to our listeners, as well as those in Congress, a constitutional reset of sorts. Bruce has written that, quote, Donald Trump's precedents lie around like a loaded weapon, ready for himself or any successor to destroy the majestic handiwork of the Constitutional Convention that gave birth to the United States. Unless regular constitutional order is restored immediately, executive tyranny will be our ruination, unquote. So, to that end, he has outlined 13 impeachable offenses that could be leveled at the president. Most are exclusively particular to Donald Trump, but there are others which could be leveled at the past half dozen presidents as well. Each episode will dive into a single count in the indictment, so to speak, so you can binge listen if you'd like, or just digest them one at a time in any order. So let's begin. Take it away, Ralph.
Thank you, Steve. I said that Donald J. Trump is the most impeachable president in American history, which is why we're going to carefully, with constitutional specialist Bruce Fein, go through one impeachment count after another. Donald Trump has made no secret of his performance, his policies, and his statements. He has said, quote, I have an Article 2 where I have the right to do whatever I want as president, end quote. He has openly, brazenly done these impeachable offenses without excuses, other than once in a while to cite that some of his predecessors did the same thing. But as Bruce Fein will point out, President Donald Trump has gone where no other president has gone. The precedent, without exercising the impeachment authority of the U.S. Congress, Donald Trump's precedents will lower the bar for future presidential candidates and future presidents, as well as lower the expectations of the American people of what they should demand in terms of presidential performance and behavior. Just for our audience, I'd like to ask Bruce a series of quick questions to frame this whole series of impeachable offenses. First question, where in the Constitution is the impeaching authority for Congress?
Well, it's in Article 1, Ralph. It specifically provides that the House of Representatives shall be the sole judge of impeachment, and it provides that the Senate, by a two-thirds majority, is empowered to be what you could call the jury that renders a judgment on impeachment articles. And in the case of the president, it provides that the Chief Justice of the United States will preside. And we also have in Article 2, Section 4, the definition, to the extent it's specific, of an impeachable offense. It says the president, vice president, and other officers of the United States shall be subject to impeachment and removal for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. The greatest ambiguity is over high crimes and misdemeanors, is what we'll elaborate on later today, although I also believe that bribery has been involved with regard to soliciting assistance from the Ukraine in order to help Trump's 2020 campaign against Mr. Biden in exchange for Trump's decision to release $400 million in military and other aid to Ukraine.
Now, Bruce Fein, why did the framers of our Constitution, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Mason, and others, put an impeachment authority in the Constitution? Why didn't they think elections were enough to hold a president accountable?
They believe that we don't have what you might call a plebiscitary democracy, where in between elections, the president or other officials can do what they want. They were very distrustful, executive power especially, and therefore didn't want to wait around before a president could destroy our constitutional architecture and then hope you could repair it after an election. Oftentimes, and it's more true today than it was in 1787 when the Constitution was drafted, the president can take a wrecking ball to our constitutional system, get us involved in illegal wars, illegal surveillance, violating due process well before the end of his term. Mm-hmm. And the framers didn't want to require the country to simply indulge these excesses that could be lethal simply till the 4-year term expired.
Yet Congress has been very cautious about invoking its impeachment authority. Crisply, how often has it been used in American history?
Well, the predominant use has been with regard to federal judges, Ralph, and it's been maybe a half a dozen times, not even at the Supreme Court level. There was one case early on, Supreme Court Justice Samuel Chase was impeached, but he was acquitted by the Senate. The impeachment was largely because the Republicans in the House at the time didn't agree with many of his interpretations of the Alien Sedition Acts. But the acquittal basically established the proposition you don't impeach judges because you disagree with their opinions. You seek to have them reversed in the ordinary processes of law. But with regard specifically to presidents, there have been 3 cases. The first was Andrew Johnson in 1868. There was a 13-count impeachment article voted against him. He was acquitted by 1 vote. You need a 2/3 vote in the Senate to convict. Then the next, and this is the one I was involved in, 100 years later, Richard Nixon was subject to 3 articles of impeachment by the House Judiciary Committee. He resigned before the House of Representatives voted on the 3 articles of impeachment. They consisted of obstruction of justice, misuse of official authority for wrongful political or other purposes, and flouting a congressional subpoena. And then he did resign, but it was only after the Senate Republican leadership entered the White House with Barry Goldwater and Hugh Scott and said, you have no votes in the Senate. If you don't resign, you'll be convicted. And that caused Mr. Nixon to leave office. Then we had the case of William Jefferson Clinton in 1998. He was charged with perjury and obstruction of justice in conjunction with the investigation of Paula Jones, a civil case, and then whether or not he committed perjury or obstructed justice by tampering with witnesses. It was voted in the House. 2 articles went to the Senate. They did not get a 2/3 vote to convict. There was 50-50 on one count, 50-45, I believe, on another count. Those are the only 3 precedents we have. But with regard to the scope, I call sometimes the industrial scale, constitutional violations by Mr. Trump, they're at a level never seen before.
It's important for listeners to realize that these counts of impeachment that are going to be described by Bruce Fein are not theoretical and abstract. They have ramifications and consequences right down to where everybody lives, works, raises their family in a whole variety of ways. And I hope listeners will keep that in mind as Bruce proceeds to examine one count after another. It's important for us as citizens to have a reasonable degree of patience in listening to all these impeachable offenses and to decide for themselves as voters and citizens what role they wish to play vis-a-vis the deliberations in Congress.
The overall concept behind the impeachment article with the subcounts comes from Article 2 in the Constitution itself. Right in the article are the words that the president is required to subscribe to in order to enter office. He must take an oath to support, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Indeed, that requirement in the Constitution itself is derived from the English Bill of Rights, 1689, where the Parliament then required William and Mary to take an oath to support and enforce parliamentary laws and not act like their kingly predecessors would dispense with the laws that they didn't like. So there's already built into Article 2 this overall obligation of the president to take whatever efforts are needed to support and defend the Constitution. And it's that obligation that forms the foundation for the impeachment article against Mr. Trump with many, many counts.
In the impeachment of Donald J. Trump, count 1, solicitation of bribery.
First, the campaign finance violation. The campaign finance laws are quite clear that if you solicit, even if your solicitation doesn't work, anything of value to influence the outcome of an election from a foreign nation or a foreign individual, doesn't have to be a nation, then that solicitation becomes a crime, because we do not want, according to Congress, foreigners to be influencing our elections, since they have motives that would necessarily be consistent with our national interests. And what I think Mr. Trump has conceded, in at least the transcript of a phone conversation he had with the newly elected president of Ukraine, that he was asking, I would like you to open an investigation against Mr. Biden and his son for a suspected corruption, gas industry or otherwise. And if you do that, he says, by the way, I can give you a visit to the White House, which is an exercise of an official duty, or, I can release $400 million in military and other aid. But he's soliciting help from the government of Ukraine to help against a possible rival in the 2020 elections, Joe Biden. That's a clear campaign finance violation. Again, it was like, I believe, when the Trump campaign met with Russian officials in the Trump Tower, I think it was June, and said, well, we're looking for dirt on Hillary Clinton. Well, if you do that and you're asking foreign officials to provide that of value, that again is soliciting something of value from a foreign country to influence the election, which is a crime. So that's one criminal violation. The other comes into play, the common understanding of bribery. It's in the United States Criminal Code. And here we have, again, the soliciting of a bribe. What was Mr. Trump soliciting? Something of value for himself. Again, aid in running against possibly Joe Biden in the 2020 election by investigating and having that investigation known of Mr. Biden and his son and his son's company by the Ukrainian authorities for alleged corruption. And in exchange for that value, Mr. Trump was honoring, okay, I will exercise my official duty to invite you to the White House, and here's $400 million in military and other aid. That is a classic definition of bribery. And of course, the impeachment clause does specifically mention treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanors as the standard for an article in a trial.
Right. Do you think that if the House passes an article of impeachment based on the Ukraine situation, that would be sufficient exercise of their constitutional duties vis-a-vis Donald Trump?
No, and I think it's not just with regard to Trump. Remember, the members of Congress, Ralph, have every bit as much an obligation to enforce and defend the Constitution as the president. It's an oath that's prescribed in Article 6 of the Constitution. There's a statute as well. And the difficulty, if you just charge one when you have virtually scores of violations, is you're giving a green light and saying, as long as the president avoids a shakedown of a foreign country, you're not going to be impeached and removed from office. You can run illegal wars, illegal surveillance, appointment clause violations, treaty violations, turning your thumb at Congress and not responding to subpoenas and document requests. So it would really do virtually nothing to cure the ailment we now have of limitless executive power. Indeed, it would almost foster more limitless executive power, because any successor to Trump would say, well, Trump, all I need to do in order to avoid impeachment then is make sure I don't have my own President Zelensky phone call, but otherwise Congress didn't care about all other violations. I guess I can emulate them and not need to worry. That, in my judgment, would be a disaster. I keep coming back and I sound like a broken record because I think it's so important. If presidents can go to war on their own and in wartime suspends all due process and you spend that limitless power and you can surveil what heart's content, you suspend all these laws, declare national emergencies, there's no way that liberty is going to survive. It will be simply crushed on the installment plan.
And the lowering of the precedent, lowering of the bar for presidential lawlessness will also encourage a debasing of who decides to run for president in the first place. It will encourage candidates who basically say, hey, look what Trump's gotten away with. I do the same thing, and I'm going to be able to run for president. And that corrupts the whole electoral process and the primaries.
And that is count one in the impeachment of Donald Trump, solicitation of bribery. Join us again for count two, obstruction of justice.